Whenever you create something, you know that if you look at it long enough, you'll find flaws. At some point, you've got to step back and say, good enough. A finished product is the point where the creator finally gave up. Final Fantasy XII is not a perfect game, but it doesn't need to be. When it's easy to overlook issues with a game, when you can point at something you don't like and say, hey, this sucks, but it doesn't matter, that's when you know you're playing something special. The story is my favorite part of Final Fantasy XII, and I'm not going to talk about it much. A good story needs to be experienced, not explained. All you need to know is that unlike every other mainline Final Fantasy, this is a mature storyline with fantastic English script and some of the best voice acting in the history of video games. Is it faithful to the Japanese version? Probably not, but that doesn't matter. I care more about the quality of the writing than I do about faithful adaptations. Watching these cutscenes is like watching a stage play. Do you have any idea how refreshing it is to play a game from Square Enix where the story is an absolute treat to watch from start to finish? That said, I do want to talk about Vaan for a minute. So let's make one thing clear right now. The claim that Vaan is not the main character of the story, that he can be removed without consequence, that Bosch is the main character, or any one of the many criticisms you can find online regarding Vaan's role in the story. Vaan is the main character. It's through his eyes that we witness the events that unfold. You may question his importance in the story, but that doesn't change the fact that he is the player's insertion into this world. And this is nothing new. Square used a similar approach in Final Fantasy X. The plot revolves around Yuna's pilgrimage, but the story is told from Tidus's point of view. Because this is a fantasy world with concepts that the player wouldn't be familiar with. So instead of forcing you to read an in-game glossary to become familiar with the world, or awkwardly have characters address concepts they'd have no reason to discuss, characters can explain to the main character what's going on, and by extension teach you, the player, about the world. Vaan and Penelo know very little about this world. They grew up as orphans in a slum. It makes sense for them to pair with world travelers like Balthier and Fran, who can explain to them about the warring countries, different races, and the strange locales they've visited.
We can reach the wood any number of ways, but the easiest is to head north from Nalbina.
There's a hunter's camp just beyond the Salika wood.
It's a seamless method of immersing the player in this world without forcing them to read a book. Final Fantasy XIII avoided this approach to storytelling and instead presented a cast where the characters were already familiar with the world. The game doesn't explain much, and it's up to the player to take the time to read the data log to understand most of what's going on with the people, places, and technology.
The Purge was SciComm. Private Sanctum troops, not the Guardian Corps.
Post-Foul C and their lessee are enemies of the state.
Framing a scene requires finesse. Too many directors take the easy way out, keeping a static camera on the cast and just switching between speakers. Something you see in a lot of Japanese role-playing games is this style where illustrations swoop in and out of the screen, while the camera remains motionless and the characters are barely animated. This doesn't take advantage of video games being a visual medium. It's lazy presentation. There are even little touches in the animation, like when the crew boards Balthier's airship and you can see the characters ducking to enter the cockpit. The cutscene director gets all the credit here. He previously worked on Vagrant Story, which had a similar style of camera design. For games that insist on pausing the action to show you a movie, they better make damn sure that movie is enjoyable to watch. Proper framing of a scene goes a long way towards keeping your attention. If you're playing Final Fantasy XII these days, odds are you're playing the Zodiac Age version, a very good port that unfortunately has some balancing issues if you don't know about the International Zodiac Job System version. This was a Japanese exclusive release that introduced some tweaks to the gameplay, most notably with the license board. In the original game, Each character shared the same board layout, this enormous board, and you could veer in any direction you choose. But once you got far enough in the game, everyone filled out the board in its entirety and every character could wear anything and use any spell. The International Zodiac Job System version rebalanced the game by introducing jobs. These smaller grids had more focus licenses, which meant each character had to commit to their specific job. You couldn't outfit everyone with cure spells anymore without compromising your team composition. Then when Zodiac Age released, each character could now specialize in 2 jobs, but the game wasn't rebalanced with this in mind. It has the same balancing as the International Zodiac Job System version, so if you pick up a second job, you're effectively turning on easy mode. But the solution is simple. Pick one job for each character and stick with it. But new players are not going to know about the history of each version, and are going to make the game far too easy once they pick up their second job. But for players that enjoy challenge runs, you can try out some really cool playthroughs like having each character use the same job, or trying out New Game Minus, which locks each character at their starting levels for the entire game. And each job is well themed. I won't go over all 12, but just for an example, White Mage is a clerical role, so it makes sense that the weapon selection for the class is extremely bare. You're relegated mostly to rods, which deal very little damage, but can inflict buffs like regen when you hit your own party member, so even the act of attacking fits with the theme of the class. Bushi has a lot of licenses that revolve around boosting magic potency. This should clue you in that katanas scale with the magic stat in addition to strength. But not only that, Bushi learns the Shades of Black technique, which randomly casts a black magic spell. In the early game, you can use this to cast endgame level spells, which just destroys normal enemies. It's also very useful for targeting flying enemies that melee attacks can't reach. So these changes to the license board really help to flesh out each character into a more unique role, and it incentivizes swapping between reserve party members more frequently, something I almost never did in the original version. So let's go over the various dungeons and mechanics in the game and why it stays engaging the entire time in spite of its issues. We begin with a straightforward tutorial that's not really needed, but at least it's brief. I never understood the point of teaching players how to work the sticks on a controller. This technology is decades old. They're self-explanatory at this point. You have the option of playing with ATB, Wait, or Active. For newer players, Wait appears to be the easier choice since it pauses the action, giving you an unlimited amount of time to make decisions mid-battle, but it pays off to learn how to play on Active because you can queue up actions like healing items or spells and time them at the precise moment they're needed. But you're not punished for preferring one playstyle over another. For fans of the Super Nintendo and PS1 era Final Fantasies, Active will feel like a more familiar playstyle. Chests are randomized, and not just in their spawn rates. Most of the time you'll get a handful of gil or some consumable items, which is nice because it means you don't really need to spend much time actually buying these from stores since you'll naturally accumulate them. But some chests have a chance of giving you gear that's even better than what you can presently purchase from shops. Out of nowhere you can grab a sword that's a juicy upgrade over what you're currently using. Some spells and techniques can't even be purchased from shops. You find them in chests hidden deep within optional areas. The problem with this system is that it can be abused. In a game that's already fairly easy, you can run back and forth between zones to farm chests for items that you can't purchase until much later, like ethers, or grab gear that's a tier above whatever's currently in the shops, which means money isn't as precious of a resource as it should be. But at least the chests do serve to reward the player for exploring these areas. Exploration plays a large role in engaging with most of the optional content. Dependent on the weather, certain enemies may spawn. There are rare monsters to hunt with different spawn conditions, and most of the summons in the game are optional and hidden in areas that you'll never visit during the main storyline. Here's some level design taken straight out of a Zelda game. One of the first major dungeons introduces these mimics that feed off the exposed wiring throughout the tunnels, and they siphon the power of the area. If the power level drops too low, undead start to spawn, so you're encouraged to target these specific enemies before all else. So even in the beginning of the game, there's a dungeon that's a bit more involved than just cruising through a labyrinth. Even the boss makes use of this mechanic. She'll spawn little mimics that rush the walls to suck the electricity dry, which heals the boss, forcing you to apply the knowledge you learned while exploring the dungeon to the boss of the area. The The next dungeon is fairly straightforward by comparison. You progress through a mining facility and come across plenty of undead, which is actually a great opportunity to practice chaining. Killing the same species multiple times in a row creates a chain, and the higher your chain, the better the drops you'll get from killing those enemies. It's simple to understand, and you can choose to ignore it without consequence, but for players that enjoy grinding, the chaining system rewards you for killing specific enemies sequentially to increase your odds of getting a rare drop. You can also get a higher quantity of drops as your chain level increases, which means more loot, and that means more money. So let's take a break here to talk about the bazaar. The primary method of making money in this game is by selling loot that drops from enemies. You can get money from chests and a handful of other means, but for the most part you're going to rely on selling your junk. The beauty of this system is the bazaar, a shop that sells item bundles and sometimes even unique gear, but the inventory is dependent on what loot you sell. Everything you sell to shops is connected to the same bazaar, and the junk you sell accumulates throughout the game. Once you fulfill certain conditions, which are invisible, you'll unlock items for purchase. It's a pleasant surprise to offload all your crap and suddenly be alerted to new offerings in the shop. So obtaining rare loot serves two purposes: more money from the sale, and better unlocks. The one drawback here is that you can't sell loot in bulk. You need to spend a bit more time in shop menus than you really should. Once you leave the mines, you're greeted with one of two instances of mandatory filler in the entire game. You need to run around town shouting,
"I'm Captain Bosch von Rotzenburg of Dalmasca,"
at residents while avoiding the soldiers. It's not challenging, there's no combat involved, there's no depth to this whatsoever. It's just a waste of time for a few minutes, something that could have been accomplished with a 30-second cutscene. And, in fact, is.
So Bosch von Rotzenburg does yet live.
Eventually you wind up on an airship, and when you pass through these lasers, the alarm will sound, summoning a group of enemies. You can ignore this mechanic and deliberately walk into the lasers to summon enemies for experience. If this was intended to punish the player, the game should have spawned a dozen enemies, you know, something overwhelming. And it's not like it's hard to avoid these lasers because they're stationary. Maybe having them flicker on and off or move back and forth through the halls would make this more challenging. But more than anything, this mechanic is used to teach you about the alarm. Once you rescue Ash, you have to retreat through the entire ship with the alarm blaring non-stop, summoning endless hordes of enemies. Your only reprieve is you can deactivate the alarm for 60 seconds at specific locations on the ship. This is a rescue mission. Your objective is to get the hell off this ship, so it makes sense that the game tries to create this sense of urgency to hurry you along.
So where exactly is Wraithwall's tomb?
We must first cross the Yogir Yensa, and beyond that the Nam Yensa, before we reach the tomb.
When you first enter the tomb, you'll come across a familiar boss if you've played other Final Fantasies, and you were already taught to run away from a boss if he's too difficult back in the Lusu mines. But there's another one, and there's no running this time because the first demon wall is pressed up against the door. And you're on a clock. The demon wall is slowly pushing you down the hall, and to make matters worse, he can banish a party member. But it's all for show. This isn't a difficult game, but it does a nice job of creating tension here. Creative bosses will always be more entertaining than straightforward ones that hit hard. I love the bosses in Demon Souls for this reason. It's better to have bosses with unique mechanics than a gauntlet of similar ones that kick your ass. The main boss here is Belias, the first Esper you'll come across. Espers have an interesting role when it comes to the license boards. Characters do not share Espers, but not only that, Espers unlock these isolated portions of the board, so there's an opportunity cost here. If you have a character acquire an Esper to gain access to new licenses, you're permanently giving up the ability for other characters to learn skills. Opportunity cost is true player choice, though this example is on a very small scale. Impactful choices come from giving something up. A better example can be found in Tactics Ogre. When you choose a route, you're giving up the characters you can recruit from the other routes, in addition to the story differences. Once you complete the events at Galmor Jungle, you can proceed one of two ways to reach your next destination. One way is to fight a boss, but you can also enter a late game area called the Feywood, a path the game indirectly warns you against taking by filling that route with high-level enemies. If you flee past the mobs, you can find an alternate entrance into the Paramina Rift. Branching paths are more interesting when there are incentives for taking each route. If the boss is giving you a hard time, You can still progress through the game, just in a less obvious way, rewarding players that like to explore. But there's no real reward for taking on the boss outside of just enjoying the fight. He has a nasty combo where he applies oil to your party members and follows up with fire attacks. So if you're playing on ATB active, this is a great opportunity to ready handkerchiefs to heal the status. Of course, if you've already played through the game several times, you can just come prepared with the appropriate Gambits. Gambits allow you to fine-tune the AI for your party members. Instead of sifting through menus during every encounter, Gambits let you automate some of the actions you'd want to use, but it's deliberately limited in functionality to prevent you from completely automating the game. They don't get too specific. For example, you can create a simple command like heal an ally when their HP drops below 50%, but you can't make a Gambit that says use Cura when the average HP of the party drops below a certain percent. Likewise, you can't chain Gambits with conditionals. You can steal from an enemy with 100% health, and you can steal from the party leader's target, but you can't create a condition to only steal from the party leader's target if it has 100% health. The game allows you to automate simple commands, but for more specific situations you need to take the wheel. Let the AI handle more mundane tasks like targeting enemies and keeping HP up, while you cast the more situationally dependent commands. And sometimes you need to react on the fly because you don't have unlimited Gambit slots. Gambits work wonders on smoothing out the pace of the combat. In a game where movement and position matters, constantly sifting through menus to issue commands for 3 different characters would be a nightmare. In earlier Final Fantasies, this wasn't an issue because characters remain stationary during battles, and there are distinct battle and exploration screens. When you fuse everything into one seamless experience, the game needs to be rebalanced. It's easy to understand why people have a gut reaction to hating Gambits, but the game doesn't create the Gambits for you. You need to put in some effort here. If you're constantly adjusting your Gambits to automate the game, that is you, the player, still finding a solution to combat, just in an indirect way. You'll find your first crystal bug enemy here. Mimics aren't new to the series, but this is the first time a mimic gives you a false sense of security. Thankfully, he turns into a proper save point once he's dead. What's really cool about crystal bugs is that there are only 3 in the game, but you don't know that, so for first-time players, from this point on you become paranoid that any save point can be a mimic. This is a great time to bring up Quickenings. When you use a Quickening, a timing minigame starts where you try to chain together a combo of attacks between your characters under a time limit. The more difficult a combo is to pull off, the better the finishing attack. There's an element of luck involved, but you also need to be fast, and you're rewarded by shaving huge chunks off a boss's health bar, sometimes even enough to kill them in one shot. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Quickenings because in the original game, they were tied to your MP bar, so when you used them, you were punished by draining your magic. In these re-releases, Quickenings have their own dedicated meters, so you're free to use them whenever they're available without any drawback, making them a bit of a crutch. Thankfully, the Quickenings drop off in terms of usefulness, and it's always faster to just attack normally than sit through these animations. At this point, the game has you embark on a long trek to Arcades. As a break from the front-loaded cutscenes during the first half, this portion of the game focuses primarily on exploration with just a few interruptions. You can also engage in most of the extra content the game has on offer, like fighting optional bosses, acquiring new espers, new hunts open up, and you're incentivized for engaging in this content, not just by fighting unique bosses, but by gaining access to new areas and acquiring unique gear. I am not the biggest fan of side quests and optional content in games. They undo any sense of urgency the plot creates and hurt the flow of the game. Pacing is important. If you've ever stopped playing a game and never knew why, it's probably because the pacing was slow. If you get distracted with too many side activities, you lose the flow of the plot. Have cutscenes that drone on for too long, and you start itching for more gameplay. Gaps between story that are too large, and you start rushing to get back to the story. Finding that right balance between gameplay and cutscenes in an RPG is difficult, which is why I tend to skip as much optional content as I can. That said, at the very least this content is 100% skippable. You're not punished with insane difficulty spikes by ignoring it, and the game doesn't even go out of its way to tell you that these quests and boss fights exist. This is stuff for people that like to savor their games and squeeze as much out of them as possible. And as far as optional activities go, fighting unique bosses and getting summons out of them is a hell of a lot better than being handed a big list of materials to gather. And the best part is that if you skip these distractions, this part of the game goes by really quick. These areas don't take that long to progress through. And remember when I said there were 2 unavoidable instances of filler? Here's the second. You need to ride an air taxi, but the driver will only let you on board if you pay him in pinewood chops, a currency you get by partaking in this minigame where you talk to people, learn keywords, and try to match them with the person that needs that information. This minigame is nothing more than a time sink. You can't fail it, it just takes time. And the worst part is that characters have nicknames that clue you in on who you need to talk to, but these nicknames only appear once you've already spoken with them, so you need to run back and forth talking to everybody in all of these areas. You only need to do this 3 times if you want to gain access to the story area, but if you want to gain access to this part of the city that you need to visit as part of a different, unrelated side quest, you need to complete this quest in its entirety, which means matching 28 pairs together. Even playing at double speed, it took over 20 minutes to complete this quest. You could buy the pinewood chops for 20,000 gil each, which means you'd need to amass 560,000 gil if you want to avoid this side quest in its entirety, and that means you need to deliberately go out of your way to grind for money, which takes much longer than running around town for 20 minutes. Maybe if this were tied behind an interesting minigame I wouldn't mind it, but it's just a straightforward match 2 puzzle. Try doing this on the PS2 version where there wasn't a fast forward option. Not much to say about this dungeon, but I do want to highlight Cid's voice actor, who does a phenomenal job. A story is only as good as its villains, and in Final Fantasy XII almost every villain steals the show.
You're a babbling fool.
A trial for a Shelia Banargin Dalmasca!
You lust for the stone's power, do you not?
And it's shocking how, as great as these voice actors are, some of them didn't really voice a whole lot of games. Cid's voice actor did one other game, it was on the PS1, and it's almost 25 years ago at this point, and he sounds fantastic there as well.
You must be a Dunpeel. Why do you hunt us for the humans? We share the same blood.
This area is flooded with mist. There are a handful of these regions in the game, and they accelerate your MP regeneration. But running out of MP really isn't an issue in this game, especially at this point. What's interesting is that much earlier in the story, Fran goes berserk because of the mist, and becomes uncontrollable during a boss fight. Would have been pretty cool to punish the player for using Fran in these mist-heavy zones as well, by forcing her to acquire the berserk status effect, but that isn't the case. To catch you off guard, the boss here is in an arena that rapidly drains your MP, and there are status effects flying around non-stop, which is really cool because if you've been relying on your white mage to do the heavy lifting, you've got to switch up your strategy. Once you pass this, you've got a little puzzle where you've got to follow these illusions to get through this foggy area. Bit of a shame that if you inspect the floor, the game will outright tell you the solution to this puzzle, just follow the mirage, because it's not difficult to figure out on your own. This is a pretty simple dungeon at this point, just flipping switches to open gates, nothing you haven't seen before, and before long you'll come across a boss where your technics are sealed. I like that several bosses in this game try to kick away your crutches, and technics can be very powerful. But unfortunately, in the Zodiac Age version, most of the best ones are only available after you fight this boss. Here's another crutch you might be relying on, the map. The Great Crystal is deliberately designed to confuse you, with most rooms looking similar to one another, and no map to guide you as you run in circles to open gates. I'm not usually a fan of this type of level design, running around mazes until you stumble into the exit. Lots of older RPGs use this formula, but at least the mandatory section of this area is short. This kind of level design works when it's used to inject some variety into the experience. Playing an entire game with levels designed like this is just soul-sucking. And in Final Fantasy tradition, at the end of the game, you unlock the airship and can freely travel the map and visit the largest dungeon in the game, the Pharos Lighthouse, a 100-floor gauntlet packed with bosses. This technically isn't the final dungeon, but it serves as the last major dungeon, and you can tell during the approach alone. You land on an island at the edge of the world and can see the tower looming in the distance. As you explore, you'll come across the Colosseum, which of course is the site of a super boss with tens of millions of hit points. And you'll find a crystal at the base of the lighthouse, signaling that the game won't even let you enter the dungeon without putting up a fight. You can even see a decayed dragon from the distance, sitting atop the steps leading to the tower, and watch it come to life as you approach. Some nice environmental storytelling here, showing you that even the guardian of this place has been waiting so long he's fallen apart. The gimmick for the first floor of this dungeon is to pick up these black orbs that drop from enemies, and use them to break seals. It's not that interesting since every enemy is guaranteed to drop an orb, and you don't automatically pick them up, you need to interact with the orbs. And because the interact button is context sensitive, it's easy to accidentally open the command menu. This same issue happens all the time when you're opening treasure chests. The first boss of the tower is this turtle that puts up an invincibility paling, something common with the endgame bosses, and there's really not much you can do but wait until the paling goes down. Some of the bosses already escalate the difficulty as the fight progresses, hitting harder or with more frequency, so seeing something like this being used to make a fight more difficult is a real head scratcher. And that's just the first floor. Technically. The game cheats with this dungeon because once you complete the first floor, you take an elevator up to the 10th, and from that point you climb a level each time you pass a set of stairs. The game tries to slow you down for a bit by forcing you to kill these green enemies to generate bridges, and if you kill the purple ones, you'll undo your progress in building the bridges, but overall the dungeon goes by pretty fast. Which makes sense, having each floor take as long as the first would be absurd, it'd be enough content for a full game. About halfway up the tower you fight the second boss, which permanently has a regen buff. If you try to dispel it, it'll just come right back. But at least it doesn't have a paling like the first boss. You can see that as its health drops, it'll start comboing its attacks with more frequency until it kills you. Afterwards, the game gives you a choice. You need to sacrifice an ability for the next several floors. You can either disable your ability to attack, use magic, use items, or reference your minimap. Clearly this isn't a choice because taking away your minimap is the most minor of inconveniences, whilst removing your ability to use melee attacks or heal is something best left for a challenge run. Seems like it'd make more sense to disable these abilities one at a time for each floor, rather than just picking one and sticking with it for a while. To see an example of this done well, for an entire dungeon no less, see Ultimisia's Castle in Final Fantasy VIII, probably my favorite dungeon in the series. In this section, you need to touch these crystals in a specific order. If you make a mistake, you need to survive against a wave of undead for a little bit before starting all over. It's nice to experience some punishment when you fail a puzzle. Punishment is what forces a player to learn. If you're not punished, you're more likely to brute force a puzzle instead of learning the solution. And the dungeon is capped off with a boss rush, and of course, any scene with a villain is 24 karat gold.
Hear me, boss. Do not think killing the Kingslayer will win you back your honor. When you abandoned home and kin, your name was forever stained with blood.
Unfortunately, Gabranth goes down in seconds to make room for the true boss of the dungeon, Cid, who partway through summons an Esper, turning this into a double boss fight. But the game goes too easy on the player. Once the Esper appears, Cid just hangs back and takes small pot shots here and there. I think forcing your party to split up to manage two challenging bosses at once would have been much more interesting. Maybe something like Kefka's Tower in Final Fantasy VI. There's no save point in the final dungeon, you've got to complete the entire final boss gauntlet in one take. If you played the original PS2 release. Zodiac Age has autosave, which drops the difficulty down because the game saves during each screen transition. A nice quality of life change, sure, but it does lessen the punishment if you get a game over. The final boss fight is a nice visual treat. He fuses with parts of the airship, and your battle against him doesn't even show his health bar. But he also has these immunity palings that he switches between, and you just gotta wait him out. What I'm looking for when I play a game is good pacing. I like games that keep a good rhythm, when you're moving along without too many hiccups. Each person sets their own standards when it comes to pacing. Some people enjoy the Danganronpa series, but for me, there's just way too much talking and not enough gameplay.
Stop talking.
The opposite end of the spectrum can be true as well. Shmups historically take around 20 to 30 minutes to clear, but Radiant Silvergun's story mode takes over an hour. Maintaining that level of focus for an hour is more brutal than it sounds. Finding that balance can be tough, but the more games I play, the more I'm finding that I enjoy experiences with most of the fat trimmed. If I'm playing an RPG, I don't want to play this 100-hour behemoth that constantly alternates between 10 hours of dungeon crawling and 10 hours of story development. Final Fantasy XII offers a consistent blend of cutscenes and gameplay, and it does a great job of keeping the optional content out of the way. Even if the plot amounts to little more than chasing after crystals, if it wasn't about that, it wouldn't be Final Fantasy. It's the way the story is presented that I appreciate. It's so rare to find a JRPG with mature characters and professional English voice work.
Your Excellency.
A hound begging for scraps at the Emperor's table. Would you serve another master, hound?
And the combat offers just the right amount of depth. It's not so involved that you need to constantly micromanage your gear and gambits, but it's not easy enough to turn your brain off and flee from every battle and just coast through the game. If you skip the optional content, the game ends just as you're about to complete each character's license board. It doesn't try to drag out the main story, it ends when it needs to, and if you want more, there's plenty more to mess around with. And when I was younger, I fought all these optional bosses, collected all the espers, I experienced everything this game had to offer and enjoyed it. Nowadays, I'm content to just focus on the story. I guess that's the beauty of RPGs, you can play them in whichever way suits you best. Whatever issues I have with the game, I can overlook them because they don't sour the overall experience. I'm sure you can find criticisms for your favorite games, but just because a game is flawed doesn't mean it can't be your favorite game. Tons of people love Deadly Premonition for some reason, but games exist because of people, not companies. And the creative forces behind Final Fantasy XII would not go on to create Revenant Wings or any of the mainline games since 12, which is the reason why I'm not a fan of modern Final Fantasies. The original director and writer of the game, Matsuno, was responsible for Ogre Battle, Vagrant Story, Tactics Ogre, and Final Fantasy Tactics. I've played them all, I love them all. The director that took over, Ito, also worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, and he directed Final Fantasy VI and IX, both excellent games as well. Square rewarded his years of loyal service by giving him a $2 budget to develop dungeon encounters. Meanwhile, the dumbass that directed Final Fantasy X-2 and Revenant Wings was given the green light to make not one, but 3 Final Fantasy XIII games. Or worse, this hack to end all hacks that shat out a disease worse than the Black Death was put in charge of Final Fantasy XV. Is it any surprise why this game is awful? So when people say Square lost their way, we really shouldn't become attached to companies in the first place. They just own the IP. It's the people in charge of a game that you should pay attention to. It doesn't seem like the directors of Final Fantasy XII will be doing much game directing in the future, and that's okay. The games they've made are timeless, and I have no problem revisiting and recommending them.